I'm sure this third day will also have you asking for more. For today we have Kavita Singh and Sheba Chhachhi with delectable fare to feast your souls. May I request the chairman of the Chandigarh Lalit Kala Akademi, Mr. Diwan Manna, to please welcome our artists with flowers.
Sheba. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You all know that this is the third day of the Amrita Sher-Gil National Art Week, which we started on the 18th of this month, commemorating her birth centenary year, and also paying tribute to her. We've dedicated this festival to Amrita Sher-Gil. We've had wonderful evenings yesterday and day before yesterday. Anjali ji was here, Kalidas was here, then Pushpamala N, and the doyen of criticism, writing on art, and of course a wonderful manager of the affairs of the art in the country, Ashok Vajpayee ji. They were all here. Pushpamala, in fact, is still in Chandigarh. She'll join us soon to be in the audience. She wants to be listening to what Kavita ji and what Sheba ji has to share with us. I really welcome both of you, Sheba and Kavita. And it so happens that they both happen to be Punjabi. And I have known Sheba for the last almost 20 years or so. I was introduced to her by a friend in Delhi, a photographer who doesn't live in India anymore. And I had gone to her attic. Then I met her almost 20 years later, few months back at Ranbir Kaleka's home. I couldn't recognize her. Of course, she has grown in stature in terms of her understanding of art, in terms of what she's attained, what she has given to the adoring people all over the world in terms of her installations, video installations, and art. First time I saw her art in the Photographers Gallery in London. Wonderful work, and she still continues to do that. Thank you, Sheba, and we are looking forward to seeing your presentation today. Kavita, she has done her PhD under Dr. Goswami. She studied here, and I have known her also almost for as many years as Sheba. And she has traveled so much from then. She's been all over the world. She's been curating shows. She's been writing on art. She's been writing on history of art. And she's been curating shows not only in India but also abroad. And she's running a wonderful program at JNU where she teaches now, which is like full of activities. Almost every week you get a new invitation by somebody or the other from rest of the world coming and sharing their thoughts and ideas at the JNU. Thank you so much for coming over, Kavita. It's almost homecoming. Thank you, and we are looking forward to listening to you. Before we invite Kavita, Kavita will share her thoughts and ideas with us first, then Sheba, then they'll both have a conversation on the stage. Then before that, I'll request Mrs. Judge to give the introduction to Kavita. Thank you.
Professor at the School of Art and Aesthetics, JNU, curator and writer, Kavita Singh is a name to reckon with in the domain of art history. Initial training at MS University, Baroda, and a PhD from Punjab University, Chandigarh, under Professor Goswami, as Diwanji has just told you, set up for her a confluence of art, academics, aesthetics, and history, enabling her to explore the history of Indian painting, particularly the Mughal and Rajput schools, and the history and politics of museums, with special reference to India. Early in her career, she served as research editor for Marg Publications and also worked as a professional museum intern at the Asia Society in New York. As guest curator at the San Diego Museum of Art, she curated exhibitions of Indian miniature paintings in the US, Europe, and Asia. Apart from research and curatorial fellowships at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Asia Society, and the Clark Institute, she has also received a major grant from the Getty Foundation for a collaborative project to study the place of museums in the social landscape of India today. In 2009, she led a curatorial team in setting up an exhibition titled Where in the World? Indian Art in the Era of Globalization, selecting works from the Lekha and Anupam Poddar collection of contemporary Indian art. Ms. Singh's favored subjects are Sikh art, Indian folk and courtly painting, and the history of museums in India. Her name features regularly in many publications on art, as well as in catalogues for leading artists today, proving her prolixity in writing. The list of her published articles goes into a number of pages. She has also edited a number of books, the most recent among them being Influx, Contemporary Art in Asia, and No Touching, Spitting, or Praying, Modalities of the Museum in South Asia. Ms. Singh's popularity as an extremely knowledgeable speaker on art has grown with time. She has been invited to give learned presentations since 1994 at prominent institutions such as Max Muller Bhavan, Al-Kasi Foundation, the Habitat Center in Delhi, MS University Baroda, New York University, Abu Dhabi, the National Museum of Kuwait, USA, Manchester University, and in Austria. We welcome you, ma'am.
So I remember the last time I was the recipient of a very lush introduction. When the introduction ended, I also started clapping like the rest of the audience because I was so impressed by what I had heard. I was waiting for this person to appear that it took me a moment to realize it's me. So please lower your expectations immediately so that you can actually relate to what I say, because it's not going to be terribly profound. Now, as you've been told, I spend some amount of time, or I have been spending some amount of time recently studying museums in India. And you might immediately wonder what on earth I could possibly be doing when I do that, because we all know that the state of most of the museums in our country is not very good. The thing is that if you're a cultural critic, then what you study doesn't have to be very good for you to enjoy studying. In fact, sometimes it's even more fun if things are not good and you get to analyze the many ways in which they are not good. So I find many different aspects of what is the situation with museums in the country something very interesting to unpeel and look at. But it is not necessarily a question of critiquing something and saying, well, this is not functioning the way it should be, but I'm more interested in saying, okay, what do we have on the ground in India? And what are the museums that are there? What are they doing? And however poorly we may think that museums are functioning in the country, one of the important things about museums for us is that they become very important places in which some kinds of authorities or some kinds of important people put forward for you ideas of what is heritage. They put out some kind of a statement which we then either accept or argue with, but it becomes a proposition that you have to take into account. So what is heritage? And the short definition that I find most useful is this one. Heritage is the uses that the present has for the past. So if there was not something useful about a particular aspect of the past, we would ignore it, forget it, bury it. And it is that which is of some kind of use to us, which we recapitulate, foreground, polish, and present to others and to ourselves as our heritage. And then it has very profound effects on ourselves and our social formations. So I'm very interested in many different aspects of what is the formation of heritage or the ways in which it is foregrounded. And one of the areas that I have been somewhat interested in, which I would like to share with you when I look at what is happening in museums, is to look at the whole phenomenon of Maharaja tourism that we have in India today, and the way in which palaces are turning into museums and becoming part of this whole circuit of Maharaja tourism. Now, the circuit of Maharaja tourism is something that has quite a long presence in our country. If you look at the very early posters advertising tourism when it was an organized industry in its early days, you can see the way in which India is being sold as a land of Maharajas on golden howdahs. And if you look at a more recent poster, you can see that the image that is projected isn't changing all that much in all of these many years that intervene between these two posters. So there is something about the image of the Maharaja, which is a persistent trope or symbol of our heritage, which is continuously being repackaged and resold to us. And I want us to take a look at that today. But today, something about the Maharaja and the Maharaja style is in fact increasingly present instead of receding into the distance. And so you have more and more opportunities within the tourism sector to take Maharaja tours. You can go to a palace which has turned into a hotel and you can live like a Maharaja. You can enjoy the kind of views that Maharajas would have had. And if you are not the international palace hotel hopping tourist, you can certainly cook like a Maharaja or eat like a Maharaja or buy jewels like a Maharaja or wear clothes like a Maharani. You know, you can have all of these different ways of becoming close to what the Maharajas were, or in some way consuming some sort of a leftover image of what they had produced. In fact, so strong is this lure of the Maharaja that even where there aren't old palaces to be occupied, you have hotel chains making new palaces which look like old ones. All of the Oberoi's high-end villas properties are all new palaces that have been produced to look as though they were old palaces from some Maharaja's estate that you can enter and you can live in. Now, these kinds of sites, these expensive heritage hotels, are all places which are accessible to very high-end tourists. But also, you have a number of palaces that have turned into museums and which allow the general public in, and where the ticket money is not very expensive. And so these become places in which a very heterogeneous audience gets to interact and in some way come into contact with this mystique of the Maharaja. And it's something that is shared by a much larger public, and therefore it becomes a very interesting phenomenon for me to look at, to see what are these museums in the palaces and what kinds of stories are they putting out and what kinds of stories are being received by the people who go into them. Now, for one thing, I think that even the word palace museum is itself a very interesting term, because it's a kind of a oxymoron. These two things contradict each other. Because a palace is, of course, that sequestered space that a very elite person lives in, and a museum is a publicly accessible space that the democratic polity can go into. So the minute you have the term palace museum, you know that it is something from the past that has changed its relationship or its status in the present. So that itself should get us thinking about the ways in which it has changed and the ways in which people are able to access and approach certain things that were off limits for them. The question then becomes that if they can physically enter these places that would have belonged to a king or a queen in an earlier time, they're physically over there, how do they emotionally enter it? How do they intellectually enter them? How do they think about these places and the phenomena that they are coming into contact with, and are they able to make them their own in some way? So these are some of the interesting questions that to my mind are raised by the phenomenon of the Palace Museum. Now, when we start thinking about where these palace museums are located, I think it takes a little moment to reorient ourselves to look at a map like this, which shows the situation of India just at the eve of partition, where we tend to think that there was the British, then the Gandhi kicked out the British, and then we were independent India. But if you actually look at this map, the light orange areas are the areas that were the British dominions, and the dark orange areas were the princely states. So I think there were some 536 princely states which are occupying more than 40% of the territory which is today India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, which were princely states. So you can see what a complex polity there was, what a complex society there was, and what a big role that these Maharajas played politically, and how the process of actually marginalizing them, turning them into those kinds of people that they are now, who may have certain kinds of wealth but don't have political power, was actually a very complicated story and is a story which actually raises a little bit of embarrassment in one as a modern Indian as one reads it, because there are all kinds of bad things that the state did, which I won't go into today, but if you're interested in looking at the details of this history, it's a checkered moment in our past. Anyway, so what happened at the end of this process when all of these many hundreds of princes were persuaded to join the Union of India is that eventually they found themselves robbed of political power, they found themselves robbed of a substantial part of their income, they were robbed of any kind of a public role by and large, but they were allowed to retain some palaces that they lived in, some amount of their personal property, and the state also promised them a privy purse, which was a kind of a pension in lieu of the kinds of earnings that they would have had from the revenue of the state. So they are living in these palaces, and the first Maharaja to say that he cannot afford to maintain his own home on his privy purse is the Maharaja of Jaipur. And so way back in 1958, he actually opens his own palace, Rambagh in Jaipur, as a hotel, saying that he can't maintain it if he is to occupy it by himself. 1 year later, he takes another older palace of his, which is the City Palace in Jaipur, and he opens a museum in it. And so what Jai Singh is doing in this case is that he is making a place for people to stay when they come to Jaipur, and he is giving them something to do or to see when they come to Jaipur. So he is producing the first infrastructure for tourism. As time develops, you have the Golden Triangle of Delhi with its international airport, Agra with the Taj Mahal, and Jaipur as a gateway to a traditional part of India where the past is still alive, as it were, presenting themselves as this very important circuit within Indian tourism. A little while later, there's another shock in store for the princes of India, where there is the 1971 war, there is an economic crisis, and Indira Gandhi says, who are these Maharajas to deserve a privy purse at all? They are parasites on our society. We will stop the privy purse altogether. And so what happens with this is that the income that the Maharajas had has completely vanished, and they are left lumbered with these huge rambling properties which are completely impossible for them to maintain. And so the example that is actually set by the Maharaja of Jaipur then becomes a good example where many other people feel that they might also benefit by opening their palaces to different kinds of commercial activities and allowing other people to use them so that they can get some money out of that. Now, when they decide to do that, there is something interesting in the case of Rajasthan in particular, because Rajasthan has been an impoverished kind of place. It's arid, it has very poor connectivity in terms of roads or railways. It somehow doesn't, it doesn't manage to share in the greed revolution of Punjab. So it falls behind economically in many ways, it's underdeveloped. And yet at the moment when there is a need to develop tourism, or there is the sense that tourism is an option for us at this moment, at that very moment, the underdevelopment of Rajasthan actually becomes an advantage. And it becomes an advantage because it hasn't industrialized, it hasn't modernized in the way that other parts of the country has, and as a result, people have not had the money to tear down their old homes and make new ones. Yeah, they haven't sold off their old means of transport to buy cars. They have still using camel cart. They haven't actually gotten rid of their old ways of dressing, right? So underdevelopment actually turns into heritage. Right? What you have in the decades that come is a whole chain of heritage hotels that are all over the state and which are crisscrossing different paths or heritage trails, where practically everybody who has a nice home, whether it's a palace or a haveli, ends up actually producing some form of heritage hotel. Now you can have heritage stays of many kinds in Rajasthan, whether it's a palace, whether it's a haveli, or whether it's a homestay in a village, or it's in a hut. No? So this whole range of heritage from different classes has now actually become part of the kinds of heritage experiences that are available to a tourist in Rajasthan today. And you also have, side by side with the making of these places to stay or these hotels, you also have the opening of a large range of places or portions of places as museums to be visited. So you can enter a place as a viewer to have a look at what was once in the royal domain in the past. So you see these beautiful structures. So in Jaipur, for instance, you have Amber Fort and you have the City Palace, both of which are available for visitors to see. For an international audience who comes to these places, I think there is a kind of a lure of the history, glamour, luxury, Maharaja trope that is there. But from watching Indian audiences in these places, I've often found that something slightly different seems to happen, where, for example, when I'm in Patiala, I feel that people take pride in the special Patialvi past, which gives them a sense of a local cultural identity, which today is getting flattened out in the overall composite identity of Punjab as a place, right? So I think that what a lot of people respond to in the ability to go to these kinds of places is a memory of a special identity rooted in a smaller locality than the kind of boundaries that we have in the modern state today. Now, there are many of these palace museums which have opened to the public, and I'm not going to be able to talk about many of them, but I'd like to take you through one to just give you a flavor of how many of these museums function and what they offer to the visitor. So let's go to Jodhpur, to the magnificent Mehrangarh Fort, which is situated on top of this mountain in such a majestic way. As you go into Mehrangarh, you start climbing up this winding path. You're under these amazing walls that tower over you, where there are these beautifully carved jharukas, and you pass through a succession of gateways, and you enter these exquisitely carved courtyards. And as you go through these places and you start entering the galleries, you start seeing room after room that is filled with these very lovely things. There are howdahs, or golden, silver, expensive howdahs that were mounted on elephants mostly. You have weapons, and you have some galleries with costumes. But most of the time, what you are actually experiencing is just a sense of the interior space. It's like walking through one period room after another, and you get a little bit of an abbreviated sense of what things were like in those days. It's more of an experience of architecture and of interiors rather than of art, which is what we expect in a museum. Now, in and of itself, this should not be something that is very odd for us, that there should be this kind of experience, because it's a bit like the tour of the English country home, where you're allowed in to see what a superior class enjoys and experiences. Here, we are in Udaipur, actually, in the thing of cars. But what I do find odd is that when we go to the Chandigarh Museum, we go to the National Museum, we go to the Chennai Museum, the things that we are going to see put forward over there are going to be paintings and sculptures. And who were originally the patrons of these paintings and sculptures was very often the royal families themselves, right? They would patronize the artists who were making the paintings, and they would also be patronizing the temple architecture. So how is it that these families, which were the patrons of what are considered the great arts in the national museums or the state-owned museums, are actually filling their museums with none of this stuff, but with the clothes that they wore, the howdahs that they were in, the cars that they rode, the china that they ate off? And my feeling about this is that all of this presentation that is there in the museums is not just about recreating how we lived in those days, but it's actually bringing you closer into contact with the king's body. That you're coming into contact with things that he has worn, things that he has put to his lips, things that he has held in his hands. And I think somewhere there is a residue of those magical beliefs that we had of the king actually being a semi-divine person, a person who could work miracles through his own physical being. So there's some of that. And of course, on a more banal level today, there is also some of our obsession with lifestyles, where we want to see what kinds of dishes people had or what kind of table servings they had, and then go home and imitate them themselves. But whatever it is, I think that this is more of a sense of allowing the museum to be a place in which you transgress certain social boundaries that used to exist and which now you are able to step over that threshold, right? So that's what these museums are actually doing, I believe. Now, in a number of these museums, what you also have today are the people who own them, presenting themselves as the custodians of a heritage which it is their duty to continue. One person who takes this very seriously, for example, is Maharana Arvind Singh of Mewar, who does a lot of conservation work for his palaces and the objects in his palaces, has opened a number of museums, is very concerned about how things will survive into the future. Here you have him also performing certain rituals that are traditional for him to do. For example, once a year, worshipping the horses to pay respect to them. So this is the Ashwa Pujan. But watch, this is actually a poster for the Ashwa Pujan in which it is a ticketed event. And it's a ticketed event to which you, as a visitor to Udaipur, can come in and enjoy the spectacle and become part of the spectacle. So as you can see these photographs from the Ashwa Pujan that was performed a couple of years ago, you have actually the spectacle of the ceremony, and then you have the Maharana sitting there in state receiving the traditional nazar from a nobleman or a courtier over here and on this side, and also from a tourist on this side. So the lucky tourist who is able to afford the price for this is able to really feel that he became part of the Udaipur court for a day. In fact, in a number of these places, particularly in Jaipur and Jodhpur, the younger generation of the royal family has actually started event management companies in which they find ways to reprocess and repackage the heritage of their families. And so, for example, when you go to the City Palace in Jaipur, which is a museum by day, by the evening it can become a venue in which you have a party or a wedding. And you have the event management company of Princess Diya Kumari, which advertises different kinds of menus that you can choose, where if you pay enough money, you will get exactly the same kind of reception that Queen Elizabeth II had got when she had visited in the 1950s. Right? And so, for example, here's a little extract where if for your wedding you are able to meet the price, you can even get the royal family to actually come and be part of your celebrations. Now, I've been reading the work of some anthropologists who have worked on indigenous groups in Africa, so tribal groups in Africa, as well as the indigenous groups in North America, people who live on reservations, who until now had been tourist attractions for tour groups who used to come to the area, and recently have started making their own corporations where they market themselves so that they'll get a share in the profit as well as manage how their image is consumed. And it seems to me that what these younger generation of these royal families in Rajasthan are doing is extremely similar, but the only difference is that the Aboriginal populations in Africa and in North America are very poor, and the Maharaja's descendants are very rich. Now, I'll take you as a counterpoint to one more site before I end, and that is in the south. I'm going to take you for a few minutes to Mysore. Mysore, as you all know, close to Bangalore, an area that has highly industrialized, has put itself on the global map as the center of India's IT industry, and therefore, for this region, its royal past is actually not that important in its self-definition or even in its local economy. But at the same time, there is a palace in Mysore. And that palace in Mysore has become one of the key or central issues or central, it's a central linchpin of tourism in the region. Now, what happened in Mysore? In Mysore, the Maharaja of Mysore, again suffering from the lack of his privy purse, in 1976
told the government that I can't maintain this palace anymore, it's too big. So he approached the CPWD and he said, would you take it over for the purposes of maintaining and repairing it? He shifted into the west wing of this palace, and the CPWD took the central wing and the east wing. They restored it, they installed, they repaired it, and then they opened it as a museum where again you have galleries where you see the usual howdahs and costumes and paintings from olden times, and you can go through a succession of these very ornate period rooms in Mysore. Now this Mysore palace as a palace museum became very popular, and in fact about 15 years after it had been opened to the public, the government got the idea that not only should this be a place to visit, but it should also be the center of an event. So let us revive the grand Dashera procession that used to be there in the days when the Maharaja was ruling. In the Dashera festival, what you would have is a wonderful celebration of this annual festival, which is very important for all royal families, because this is an annual reaffirmation of the king's rights to rule, where what the king would go through would be a series of rituals which would reconsecrate him as a king. It's like, again, recrowning him. He would worship the weapons, and then as a kind of a newly reconfirmed king, he would do a procession and see the people and allow the people to see him. So this became a ritual which the government wanted to reinstate because it had so much pomp and splendor, but they said that of course as a ritual put on for tourists in democratic India after feudalism has died, how can we have the Maharaja touring? So they had to modify the ritual. And the way in which they modified it is they seized upon the goddess who is the clan Devi of the Maharaja, and they renamed her the Mysore goddess. So from being the Raja's clan Devi, she turned into the city's goddess, and they started putting her in the golden howdah for the procession around the city instead of the Maharaja. And of course, who would flag off the procession then would not be anyone from the royal family, but it would be the district collector or the chief minister or somebody from the current powers that be. Now, what the Maharaja did was that when all of this tourism infrastructure developed and the visit to the Mysore Museum became very popular, and the gate money that was being collected from the tickets became enough to pay for the maintenance, he told the government, thank you very much. My father asked you to do a particular job, you've done it very well, I'll take the palace back. And the government said, no way. So he said, but it's mine, I never gave it to you, and so you have to give it back to me. So what the government did was that they rushed through an act in the state legislature forcibly acquiring the palace. So the Maharaja then went to court, where the government lost the case. So then the government appealed, and the appeal is in Supreme Court. In the meantime, the Maharaja got slapped with huge tax cases as a kind of a negotiation bid. So all of that is going on. So in the meantime, while the Maharaja is fighting to get his own palace back, in his wing of the palace, he has opened his own museum called the Residential Museum. And when you go into the Residential Museum, you see a version of the same things that you see in the main museum. You see costumes, you see carriages, you see clothes and saddles and so on. But as you can see, they look quite miserable. They are very poorly conserved and they are very poorly displayed. But in this case, the poor display, I think, is part of the message, because it becomes part of the Maharaja saying, look, I've been despoiled by the government, the state has taken away my properties, this is all I can do, please come and give me a donation. And so it becomes really like a statement of the iniquities of the state. So the two museums in this same palace are telling two different stories and are using heritage and history in two very different ways. The flashpoint that occurs every year is when the Dashera festival actually has to be celebrated. Because the Maharaja in private goes through all the rituals that he is supposed to go to in Dashera. He worships the weapons and he sits on the Rajgaddi and he is reconsecrated. But he goes on a procession afterwards But unlike the old days when he would go on an elephant in his golden howdah around the city, he goes on a bullock cart inside the little grounds of his own section of the palace. So you have this very truncated little procession going on over here with these truncated rituals, which are almost like fossil rituals that are being performed in the palace, while outside for public consumption there is this big procession which is happening with this invented goddess of the city being taken around on the golden howdah. The only problem being that the golden howdah is the Maharaja's property. And so every year the government is on tenterhooks about whether he will loan it to them or not. And predictably he makes a big fuss about it every time, but then in the end he does own it. To my mind, the kind of tensions that come up in our image of these two different processions, the one of this invented cult of the city goddess going around the city, flagged off by the district commissioner, and this other one of this Maharaja who actually owns everything but is sitting and sulking in his own little compound of the palace, going on his little chakkar. To my mind, it actually brings very clearly some of the dichotomies, contradictions and ironies of the situation of the whole history turned into heritage of the Maharajas today, where as we try to just take what we want and use it as we like, there are still people around who can say, hey, what you call heritage is my history. And what do we do with that? I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kavita. No wonder at least 3 of the presenters during this Amrita Sher-Gil National Art Week who will be in front of you, they were insisting that they would want to pair with Kavita. Like, I had to kind of let some of those go. They couldn't come because they wanted only Kavita. So Sheba prevailed. And she's so wonderful. Thank you, Kavita. Sheba.
Ethiopia-born, Delhi University and NIDM, the Bard educated, and Delhi-based Sheba Chhachhi's name is synonymous with experimentation and innovativeness. Her site-specific public art and independent works employ pre-cinematic devices and multi-layered illuminated mobile palimpsests that create a new idiom through which she contemplates the personal and the political. She brings together photography, found and sculpted objects, text, film, and sound. Her unique blends of ancient iconography, myth, visual traditions, still and moving images resonate with issues of gender, ecology, violence, personal and collective memory. Through her work, she retrieves and chronicles the marginal worlds of women, mendicants, and forgotten forms of labor. The evocative titles of some of her solo shows indicate her concerns. In 2000, there was When the Gun is Raised, Dialogue Stops, which dealt with women in Kashmir. Ganga's Daughters in 2004 spoke of women ascetics. Bhogi Rogi in 2010 dealt with consumption and disease. And Winged Pilgrims is a chronicle from Asia that has evolved from 2007 onwards. This year, her photo video installation, Record/Resist, and The Water Diviner have been exhibited at the Kiran Nadar Museum. She has also held exhibitions and participated in prestigious group shows in the US, Germany, Singapore, Paris, Berlin, Cuba, Finland, Indonesia, Brazil, and New Zealand. We welcome you, madam.
Thank you. I'm going to actually pose some provocations today through sharing some of my practice. The title of my talk is The Politics of Contemplation. We normally think of contemplation as something that is actually removed from the hustle and bustle of daily life. It's withdrawn, it's a space away, it is definitely disengaged from what we consider the political, which is to do with daily life, to do with the stresses and strains of citizenship, of inhabiting an emerging economy, a troubled democracy. Contemplative is also a space where the subject of contemplation is considered to be something removed from ordinary life, the soul, the spirit, higher aspects of the mind. These are all the associations we normally make with the contemplative state. We think of contemplatives as monks or nuns or people who have, in a sense, withdrawn from ordinary life. Politics, on the other hand, as we all know and experience and live, whether in our own lives or whether through the inundation of the mass media, the television, the newspaper, etc., is something that is heated, constantly changing, riven with contestations, a complex, charged, and uncomfortable space. So what do I mean when I say the politics of contemplation? I do believe that one of the things that we experience in the current economic, cultural, socio-political regime is a major shift in the way that we experience time. Space is already, whether you think of space as land, property, or simply as space, whether public space or privately owned space, is already almost completely territorialized. It is owned, it is securitized. The shift from vast shared space to increasingly fragmented private ownership or state ownership or corporate ownership of state is something that we have watched in our cities and in our times. Time is in the process of becoming territorialized and securitized and in that sense administered in very special ways. Whether it is the advent of new communication technologies, whether it is the kinds of ways in which we receive information today, our sense of temporality is being rapidly altered. I believe that art offers a possibility to create another kind of temporality. So for me, art interventions actually offer the potential to create a site of contemplation, one in which another kind of temporality is evoked, is inhabited, thereby offering a resistance to one aspect of the kind of political changes we're facing today. This is just one thread in the series of arguments that underlie this work I do. A lot of my early work was more what would be conventionally understood as political. It was documentary photography. I was very engaged in the women's movement, and a lot of the work was, in a sense, issue-based work. I moved from that into creating photo-based installation works, and what I'm going to share with you is 4 or maybe 5 such works to think through with you this question of the politics of creating sites of contemplation in the kind of temporal, spatial, cultural moment that we inhabit today. So I take you first to a work called Nilkant, Poison Nectar. It's a work that looks at the apparent binary between poison and nectar based on a story that we're all familiar with, which is the churning of the samundar to extract Amrit, which then turns into poison, which Shiva swallows, rescuing the world from annihilation. I displace this myth onto the Indian urban situation. The work emerged in a period when I was absolutely horrified by the kind of hyper-urbanization, the production of toxicity, and the manner in which that perhaps all of us were being turned into unwitting Nilkants, where we were swallowing the poison, but perhaps we needed to think about modes of transformation, modes of containment. So these are the key questions that the installation seeks to evoke and provoke in the viewer. As you enter the space, it's a very large, I will have to describe it, and it's always very dissatisfying to show images of works that you need to actually physically be in, because these are immersive spaces, these are sites that you must actually be there. So we're doing with 50% rendition of the work. You are looking down at, it's a large space, about 25 square feet, and you're looking down at a series, 260 tiny aluminum towers, each of them turned into a miniature light box, arranged in 4 sections. The form refers to mandala yantra formations, which are basically forms of concentration, which draw you towards the center. In the 4 corners, like the 4 gates of a mandala, are 4 translights. We'll go closer to the elements of the installation. Each of the aluminum towers carries an image of one of the 5 senses. The 5 senses which are associated with the 5 elements, earth, water, air, fire. One has a sense, in fact, of fragmentation and yet reharmonizing in broader patterns. The entire installation plays with conventional boundaries. Fragmentation, harmony, city, mandala, body, city. What is beautiful, what is grotesque. These are images drawn from the landfill, biggest garbage dumps of Delhi, where garbage is turning into land. They're treated in the manner of colonial landscape. And these are what you see in the 4 corners. As you come into the center, what you see is the video. You don't actually see it like this. You're looking down on it, and it actually is more ambiguous when you're looking down on it. I'll let you watch it for a bit. The video uses a combination of painting and projection on the body itself. What is immediately recognizable as a throat here is not so recognizable when you're looking down at it from a top view. What you are essentially aware of is a very small, very concentrated, visceral movement, where that sense of struggle, of the struggle to ingest, to contain, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, but the endless cycle of this struggle, which persists, changes, etc. I won't show you the whole video, it's quite long, but just give you a sense of it. At a certain moment, the throat is revealed to be as human as it is mythic. And one of the things that I seek to do in my practice increasingly is to look at how the mythic and the social can conjoin to open up new forms of perception, new forms of reflection on our current condition. So Nilkant plays with what we normally see as oppositions. What is grotesque, what is beautiful, what is poison, what is nectar, what is fragmented, what is harmonious, what is the body, what is the city, and brings these tensions, these binaries into a position where the viewer is perhaps prompted into rethinking the seal between these binaries. As we know that in trying to produce nectar, we produce poison, and perhaps now that we have a condition of poison, we can find ways of producing nectar as they really are, one each being a part of the other. I take you now to another work which was mentioned in the introduction. This is a work which developed over many years of engagement with Kashmir, with the Valley, where I was part of a women's group that first went in 1995, troubled by the fact that there was no representation at all of women in the entire discourse on Kashmir. The discourse on Kashmir was dominated by sets of men with guns, whether they were patriots battling for the nation or whether they were militants seeking their own autonomy and secession from the country. The whole debate was again completely polarized. Hindu, Muslim, India, Pakistan, militant, soldier, etc. One had absolutely no sense of what women felt, how they perceived the situation, and how they survived in the situation. So what you find here as you enter is an extremely long, it's about 50 feet long, bed of earth on either side of which are brick platforms. Each platform has a small bed of rice and carries a wooden rihal. Rihals are the wooden stands used for all our holy books, from the Quran to the Guru Granth Sahib to the Gita and the Bible. Somewhat subversively, what we inserted into the wooden book stand were rusted iron sheets which form a kind of book, like a detritus of war, each carrying a photograph and a testimony. As you walk around the two sides of the installation, two things happen. One is that people who normally encountering image and text, which is the most conventional form of communication and representation that you can find, would move fairly fast and probably not read the text. Immediately slow down. And because you had to make an effort and bend down to the platform to actually read what was written there and engage more intimately with the image, just as one does with a book, a kind of procession started forming as viewers went around the work. As they encounter the 36 books that are placed there, what they encounter is a breaking up of these simple categories. Muslim itself is not a single category. They are Shias, they are Sunnis, they are Bakarwal, they are Gujars. There are a number of different subject positions simply within the phrase a Kashmiri Muslim within the valley. There are a number of different relationships to the militancy itself. There are women who have been sexually violated by militants. There are women who have been sexually violated by the army. There are women who have fought back. There are women who have succumbed. There are mothers, sisters, a number of women who have found ways of living through this crisis. And for them somewhere, and this is a statement that is disturbing to everybody, the difference between one man with a gun and another man with a gun is not that great. And so what emerges as you move through this is one, a breaking up of the very fixed, polarized discourse on Kashmir to create a third space, a space where you humanize the discourse because you are actually listening to ordinary women talking about their lives and their experiences. And you are also profoundly moved by the dignity and courage of these women who, in the midst of a 22-year-old undeclared war, actually speak of compassion. And this is where I think the seeds of conflict resolution lie. I'll just show you a few of the photographs. The texts and photographs are also mixed up, so it's not necessary that the particular image and the particular text go together. The testimonies are collected over 6 years of research. And what happened in the showing of this work is interesting. When we first made this work, it was almost impossible to show it anywhere. Everyone was afraid it was too hot, it was too political, it was difficult. And we finally got the possibility of showing this as part of the umbrella of a Women in Conflict gathering, Women in Conflict in South Asia. And while we were setting up the work, this was in the Visual Arts Gallery in the Habitat Center in Delhi, the organizers got very nervous and removed their name and anything referring to who they were from the entire space. We were asked if we would allow the installation to be vetted, and we said, we would not allow this and we would stand by our work. This was a period when there were a lot of attacks on artworks, etc. This is 2000. Very interestingly, what happened was an extraordinary response. I think Chandigarh would also be a place which would have very passionate feelings about Kashmir. It links into also partition, histories, shared narratives that we have. People started flooding in. There was a tremendous response in media. And by the next day, we had to open at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was scheduled to open at 2 o'clock, but people were standing outside waiting. We also had more formal discussions with groups of students, as well as a visitor's book in which people wrote very long texts. Many of those texts actually seem to be deeply grateful for the fact there was a space to speak about Kashmir in a language that was different. The installation itself uses two elements, which are, one is the Mughal garden in terms of the overall geometry, and the Havan, the little platform of books, and creates a completely different bodily relationship to what could otherwise have been encountered as not unfamiliar kinds of statements and images, except that these were women that had never been heard before. So I offer you this as another attempt to create a site of contemplation where perhaps a more direct, complex and difficult political situation is able to open up another kind of discourse. The work is unfortunately still absolutely relevant today. I take you now to another work called Winged Pilgrims, A Chronicle from Asia. I'm not going chronologically because I'm actually trying to present these works as... So one of the entries into this work is through sound, so let it just play. This is a work that uses three elements, both material and metaphoric. The figure of the pilgrim, the figure of the bird, and the kitsch street toy called a plasma action TV of Chinese manufacture that I found flooding markets in India. These plasma action toys usually carry kitsch imaginary landscapes where you have Golden Gate Bridge, dolphins, fighter planes, Dubai skyscrapers, all collaged together into some kind of utopic vision. A lot of these utopic visions are pastoral and have a kind of fantasy of nature as landscape always had. This work begins in 2006. 2005 saw this extraordinary panic over bird flu, which was called as Asian avian flu, where for the first time in history, a huge number of birds were actually culled, killed, murdered. You can use the most polite form of the term. And the migratory patterns of birds were sought to be controlled. This has clear implications for the panic over Asian migration into the West. The first bird that was killed was a wild swan as it entered Scotland. For me, this provoked a series of thoughts about the Huns, which for us is embodies the power of discrimination. They say that the Huns can separate milk from water. And it seemed that in murdering this bird, we were also metaphorically murdering that capacity in ourselves. Birds have always stood for the more elevated aspect of the human. And through history, you have stories of birds, legends, parables, folk tales, which actually developed this as a kind of companion to human aspiration. So, placing the metaphor of the bird on one side, the other is the question of landscape as a mediator and as a signifier of the kind of relationships that human beings are making with the earth. Bringing this all together into a mapping of Asian cosmopolitanism, looking at what globalization means. We have tended to see globalization as the West happening to us, but not really looked at another sideline into earlier forms of cosmopolitanism, of exchange across Asia. So this work tries to work with these several complex layers. It's an installation which uses 11 light boxes and these 5 sculptures. The robes evoke the absence of the pilgrim. The Lohan was traditionally represented as carrying the first text, the first sutras that went from India to Japan. And here instead what they're holding is a motion lamp, a kitsch toy from the market, which actually, 2 of them are direct quotations from the market of the landscapes that I just described. I don't think I have an image of those. And the others are images that I have created which speak about bird flu, where the men in contamination suits seem to have some kind of peculiar relationship with the robes of the pilgrim. So these witnesses who form one end of this long history of exchanges. So the pilgrims in the 6th or 7th century, the motion lamp and the plasma action toy now. This kind of frame the series of explorations of how birds, stories using birds as a kind of pin, a web to kind of do this historical, quasi-historical tracing, metaphoric tracing. Each light box draws on multiple landscape traditions from the Chinese classic brush painting of the Song dynasty, but brings them into juxtaposition with, for example, the pre-Sanskrit text, which is the oldest extant form of the sutra, the Garuda, which is from a South Indian sculpture, which move. The moving light box images are not so pleasurable to see in still images. What you have is a still ground and a moving layer, and one is translucent and one is transparent, and as the moving layer moves across the ground, it makes new relations and fuses with the ground in special ways. So these 11 light boxes map this kind of movement through Central Asia, the movement of music. Here, in fact, this is drawn from several miniatures, but it's a completely constructed image. Crows have historically, metaphorically brought bad news. And on the other hand, you have a shamanistic figure from Indonesia. I'm just flagging some of the many, many layers that go in to constitute these newly imagined landscapes to speak about a rich history of exchange. Coming up to, I don't have all of them here because that would take far too long. Coming up to a documentary image, the devastated Yamuna in the city of Delhi, colonial ships and the Kaha bird. Each of these birds actually also embodies a story, and a story that you find repeating itself. So the same story will appear in Persia, somewhere in India, perhaps in Thailand, and then again in Japan, which is actually an extraordinary, it's just amazing. It was, as I was discovering this, it was unbelievably rich. So I'll tell you very briefly the story of the Kaha bird, because it becomes a central allegory for what the kinds of questions that Winged Pilgrims is trying to raise. The Kaha bird, there was a poor fisherman, this will sound very familiar to all of you, who was not able to even catch enough fish to feed his family. So he was sitting disconsolate, sad by the riverbank, and this beautiful blue bird came and sat next to him and said, "Why are you so sad?" And he said, "I can't even feed my family tonight." And she said, "Your basket will always be full." And so it was, and it was so full that he could even sell the fish, and he prospered, and she would come and give him boons and blessings, and he became quite a wealthy man and had a wonderful house and was doing very well. The king heard that this magical bird came and offered all these boons to this poor fisherman and announced a prize, an enormous prize, for the capture of this bird, because the king wanted the bird. The fisherman was tempted and colluded with the king's soldiers and laid a trap. So the next time the Kaha bird came to him, he said, "You have never come and eaten at my house in all these years, so I'd like to invite you." So she agrees. And as she's flying down towards his house, she notices the soldiers hiding in the bushes. And they try to leap out to catch her, and she stops before she reaches the ground and is absolutely appalled and horrified and starts to go back up. And he is so desperate that he actually holds on to her claws, and she rises up with the fisherman dangling from her talons, appalled at the greed and ingratitude of human beings and swearing that she'd have nothing to do with this species again. It's a story about greed. It's a story about how we lose what we most treasure through greed, which I think is a fitting allegory for what we have done to our environment and to our relationship with the natural world, with the non-human world. These details give you a sense of how the layering works. So you get each time the moving layer, like for instance, the crows would move across the landscape, you would see another part revealed and another part actually mixing and meeting with the crows. I won't go into details of the other light boxes, but you come towards the end of this enclosed space. You are in a space where, which is immersive. A lot of the immersion is created by the soundtrack that you briefly heard. The track itself was specially composed for this and is based on note structures across the region by Vidya Rao and sung by her a cappella. There are no instruments, so it works with patterning and ideas of flight built into note structures across Asia. So you come to these two large light boxes which collapse some of the key themes of Winged Pilgrims into one light box. This is what this should look like rather than this. This is the flex translation, and it's much larger. The actual piece is about 60 inches by about 34 inches. One thing that happens with the moving image light boxes, which particularly interests me and brings me back to the question of constellating different forms of temporality, is that most people, when they look at it, think that this is a video. When they come close to it, they realize that it's possibly not a video, but yet there's a moving image. So just that curiosity actually makes people slow down and wait to see what will happen. And even though it is a loop that repeats itself, in the repetition and every repetition there is some element of change. So something that is neither a still image nor a moving image in terms of conventional video time creates another kind of time, an in-between time, which immediately slows people down and elicits a quality of attention which is quite different and opens up a space for minds and eyes and senses that are inundated and saturated with both the moving and the still image. I continue to work with this object, developing it further and further from that first adaptation from the street toy, but I'm not going to go into other iterations of that, but to take you into another work. So what I'm doing in Nilkant, in Winged Pilgrims, is recuperating ancient iconography, myths, fables, to calibrate an inquiry into the present. So it is a relationship to heritage, thinking about what Kavita has been saying about the uses of the past to the present. For me, I find that we have what I would think of as a kind of eco-philosophy embedded in a lot of our practices and in a lot of our stories. They've gotten evacuated of their content. They've either become mechanized ritual, or they have become mere parroting of things without actually understanding the ideas that underlie them. And I believe that this is a condition that impoverishes the ecological discourse. So a lot of my work in the recent period is about trying to recuperate this eco-philosophy in ways that can make sense to us as people concerned with the current crisis. I take you to another work called The Water Diviner. This was originally a site-specific work in the Delhi Public Library as part of a huge public art project. As you enter the space, the site is quite an extraordinary one, so let me describe it a little bit. And I found it by pure serendipity. I was passing the Delhi Public Library. It's the busy, crazy, choked with traffic road of the old Delhi railway station. And I suddenly noticed a little plaque saying, swimming pool. And I said, swimming pool in the Delhi Public Library? What is this? I went in and investigated and found, they said, ha, kuch hai. There was a small door, tiny door, about 5 feet. And it had been roughly kind of nailed shut, but the nails were loose, so I pushed it open and stepped in. And what I saw there was extraordinary. This was an ex-colonial swimming pool, about 70 feet long, with a colonial fountain on one side, piled high with rubbish, with debris, all the refuse of the library. And the library is the central library, which has more than 200 branches, including mobile vans that cover the entire district. Abandoned books, broken fans, cushions with the stuffing pouring out of it, old newspapers, etc. So this space actually was quite extraordinary, because it sat on a site of one of the oldest waterways in the city of Delhi. So when you enter this space, you enter a saturated blue light. You yourself become blue, and you navigate a fairly narrow path through these mountains of books. You can see on the top where you enter is the colonial fountain. This had been dead for about 60 years, and I actually got it running again. So the sound of falling water permeates the space. As you come down through this path, running down the central aisle, at various points they had tried to make it into a meeting hall, so they built these steps and these kind of tired platforms. You find a gutter. The gutter is a light box which carries a map from 1832 of Shahjahanabad, showing the waterways of the streets that you have just walked off. So you realize that Chandni Chowk was actually a water canal. And clearly marked here is the complex web of water systems, of drains and canals, and its relationship to the Yamuna, which is not far from the site. Alongside, as you move amongst these cascades, these cliffs of books, which seem to teeter and cascade, you find placed in between these piles of books small light boxes in the shape of books, which I call the illuminated books, and I beg forgiveness from the original use of the term. These are books that draw upon images which represented ways of living along the river, riverine culture. A lot of them are drawn from around the Krishna stories and the miniatures around the Krishna stories. This is a Jain ascetic, a classic trope of the river. And all of these images are actually tropes which are reenacted in popular cinema, whether it is the beauties bathing in the river, whether it is the lovers on the river bank, whether it is women at the well, or etc., or the ascetic or the musician. But I bring these miniatures, and this is transgressive, into relationship with what the river is today and what the water is today. So you see the same gopis and the same landscape, but the water is the water of the Yamuna today. Or you see Radha and Krishna on the river bank, but there's a new kind of lotus, which is gutka packets, etc. These two have stories, and as you wander through the entire space and spend time in the installation, and you have to actually go on the side and look at these, you are invited to remember, and literally by that I mean bringing limbs that have been separated together again, remembered. Because these stories are extant. Most people do remember these stories or some version of these stories. And they embody different ways of understanding stories about the river and the ecological condition of the river. So I'll tell you one story. So the last image you see is Balram. Yamuna, as you know, is a goddess as well as a river. And she is the lover of Krishna. But Balram also desires her. Now, Krishna is a cowherd and Balaram is a farmer. This distinction is really important. So one day, the story goes, Balaram has been drinking and wants to cool off in the waters of the river. And he's in a forest grove with some companions, and he yells out to the river and says, "Come and cool me off." And she's offended and says, "If you need to bathe in my rivers, you come to the river bank and bathe." And he puts out his plough, he's always shown with his hal, and begins to drag the river towards him. The image is of dragging a woman by her hair. And she begins to split into tiny tributaries, tiny streams. Realizing, and there's a long dialogue between the two of them, where he insists, and she finally realizes that her capacity to nurture would be destroyed if she's turned into many tiny streams. And so she acquiesces and floods the forest grove in which he's sitting. What I place below that is the first dam on the Yamuna as she leaves the mountains at Dakpatar to come down to the plains. So perhaps this tale is a tale of the first dam in mythology or in mythological history. All of these images create these juxtapositions to bring us into a sense of the past as not nostalgic, not lost, not another era which has only a sense of we were like that as significant, but significant to us right now in terms of the way we understand what is happening to our environment. The work is titled The Water Diviner because it invites every participant to be like a water diviner, to use the artwork as a divining rod, as an instrument to read, to trace the subterranean stories, geographies, and traces of water that lie beneath the choked and crowded streets of traffic. So you go from the colonial, evoked by the fountain, black water comes out of the mouth of the lion, you come down encountering these various extracts from the pre-colonial, the Mughal, and you move towards a space which is, the gutter evokes again Shahjahanabad and the Mughal period, and you move towards a large video projection at the end which could be called pre-modern or could be called outside this kind of linear historiography. I wish to leave you with this image of the dissolving, reconstituting elephant as a metaphor for cultural memory and also for an art practice which seeks to move away from the creation of objects or images or image statements to one of creating immersive experiences, experiences which offer the possibility to reconnect with multiple layers, both of personal, social, and cultural memory. Thank you.
Shivam is the word. Such a powerful, silencing presentation. I must confess, I haven't seen a better presentation by any artist in my, practice of almost 30 years or so.
That's high praise, and I don't think it's warranted.
Actually, see, I'm a photographer, and I do use camera. As many pictures I was clicking, as many shutters, sounds, I was feeling I'm the culprit. I am actually, I'm feeling embarrassed myself as many pictures I was clicking. Because we needed, even some people were coughing. It is beyond control sometimes. Sometimes we don't really try to control, but I was wishing that I don't click and nobody laughs, nobody coughs, and it has really silences an artist's role in society, so personified in such a beautiful manner, such a sensitive, silent manner. There's no other word. Probably Professor Goswami at the end of the evening would share his thoughts in a better way with us. Can I now invite Kavita to engage in a dialogue with Sheba?
It's a great pleasure, Sheba. Great pleasure to see your work, and a great pleasure to be sitting next to you, and to know that you're not just an artist whom I've known and admired for a long time, but I'm also lucky enough to have as a friend. I find Sheba's work absolutely extraordinary for many, many things, but also for the way it seems so utterly its own thing, it's original. So at a time when there are so many trends that people tend to follow, and you feel that you're able to see an artist belonging to this stream or that stream, to come upon this body of work which doesn't look like anything else or anybody else, and which retains that purity of its deep engagement with many kinds of issues, over years, is an absolutely extraordinary thing. And I want to ask you about many things about yourself, but first I'm sorry, I'm preempting what we had said we would do, but I want to say that sitting over there, calling myself a researcher, I felt so embarrassed, because look at the research that lies behind each of these projects. Look at the tremendous years of very difficult, demanding, profound and multifaceted research that you must have done for each of these. Would you like to take us into any of this?
Well, first of all, I want to object to scuttling our plan. We spent more than an hour and a half this morning planning something, which is just scuttled. So,
but be spontaneous. No?
Yes,
I'm responding to what we just saw. So,
just to say, it's a real pleasure, and it's a continuing conversation with Kavita. We've spoken before, we speak otherwise, so it's a pleasure to actually share this. It's not, it's easier because one can get into more difficult areas than one would normally be able to in a more formal or conventional frame. So research is crucial to what I do. Maybe it's partly because I do come from a funny combination of an education in the humanities and design, and not from a conventional art school background, or whether it's just my own predilection. But for me, the beginning of a work, which could be, it could be a newspaper item, like for example the bird flu. It could be a dream image. It could be a factoid from new scientific research, which I'm interested in and follow. It could be a conversation with someone. It could be glimpsing something in a traffic jam. Any of these things could provoke something. And then what I do with that something is to actually start circling around it, a bit like a dog, before sitting down. And I'll circle and circle, and the circling is research. So that's my form of actually being able to nest into something particular. I go very wide in my research, much wider than is ever reflected in the work. And this is always painful. And one of the hardest parts in the evolution of a work is actually letting go of some beloved nugget or something that seemed so magical when you discovered it, but it is not working or it's too much and all of that. So that editorial exercise is a difficult one, but it's also one that helps you to pass your thinking and to hone it to perhaps what is more essential. So research, yes, and I think that I'm not the only artist who does that. I think they are seeking to address that research can be of many kinds. There's research which is in a sense around content or a series of associations, because I'm not, I don't follow a more conventional rigorous academic research method. It would be more associative and full of tangents and wrong turns and loops and returns. There's also the research with material or with technology. So the moving light boxes are another kind of research where I see this toy. In fact, it begins even earlier, where I see another kind of magic lantern pre-cinematic device which then disappears from the streets of Old Delhi and is replaced by the Chinese plasma action toy, which then and I worked with that as well. So, and that research is one that's continuing. The light boxes I'm making now have up to 4 layers, have movements in 2 directions, and I keep saying I'm going to stop doing this, but some new possibility emerges, and it's exciting enough to continue. So research at many levels, yes.
And I was also very impressed, though I've known this before, but I was very impressed again by looking at the way in which you account for the way the visitor experiences objects in space. So there is a particular kind of a translation where, suppose Sheba goes with Sonia Jabbar, who had this project to work in Kashmir as a journalist, right? Was
it came after the installation.
Oh, really? So, oh, okay. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So the beginning of that is 1995, where I'm part of a group of journalists and activists, human rights women, and we make this trip to Kashmir, meet women. I photograph, we collect a set of testimonies, we publish a small little booklet called The Green of the Valley is Khaki. And then we decide to develop this further. In fact, what happens to us then is the need for historical research. And that's when Sonia Jabbar actually connects with this whole engagement with Kashmir. And we spend something like 3 to 4 months going through newspapers from 1942 to, that was 99, I think, 98, 99. Teen Murti, day after day. So talk about conventional research, we did that too. And because one of the most vexed questions in Kashmir was the way the history was told, and these multiple histories and these multiple stories that were contesting each other. So we went into that research. We also went into layering these statements against a background of another stream, what we call the blue discourse, which was of Sufi poetry, of Nandrishi and Lalit. So we actually had 3 very dense texts. And the first avatar of the exhibition used these.
All of them.
Used all these layers. And it went first to the 1995 International Conference in Beijing, the Women's International Conference, which happens every 10 years, where there was a peace tent, where there were a number of representations from or about women in conflict situations. There were women from Rwanda, Ireland, Kashmir, etc. There's a whole complex story there, but and that was something that was mobile, that had to be set up very quickly, so it was constructed out of strings and plastic rods stuck into buckets of rocks. And the newspaper history was something that was laid on the ground with a thick plastic sheet, transparent plastic sheet, and you had to traverse this contested history to encounter the women's statements. So we'd actually created that physical experience. There's several other avatars
of this.
And the final 2000 iteration of this work draws on Sonia's then more longer and more on-the-ground engagement in Kashmir, which continues for many years after, and results in a film and a lot of very rich writing and a book shortly.
Yeah, right. But what was interesting about that, to look at it today, as I have looked at it many times, but to look at it today, to see it projected, and to see how it could have been reduced to a feature in a magazine where you could have had image, text, and it would have been like a good piece of photojournalism. And then to think about all the decisions you make in making an installation where the physical nature of the audience's engagement with this succession of images and text turns it into another kind of experience which precisely produces what you called the politics of contemplation, or a contemplative politics, or a contemplation of politics. You know, so this kind of slowing down and allowing layers to speak to you, which I think happens through a wonderful understanding that you have of how to produce thought, not just through the mind, but in the body. And I find that this is something that is recurring and being sharpened in a lot of your work. Even what you explained about the light boxes, which I don't think, unfortunately, is very clear to those of you who haven't seen it. What happens is, sometimes even in these hospitals, you can see in these ECG machines, there's a kind of a film which is continually unspooling out of a roll. So what you have is what looks like a flat TV surface, but just below the front surface of the glass, there is a transparent film on a spool. And on that film, there are some images that Sheba has printed, and behind that is another layer which has something else printed which is static. But what is unspooling is, and it's unspooling at a very slow rate, so that the movement isn't always clear to you the instant you see it, but if you're there for a few seconds, you see that it's unspooling. And then, as Sheba says, it causes people to slow down and look at it and spend longer with it. I think you've developed this amazing capacity for thinking about making people linger, and doing it not by density of information, but actually through appealing to some senses, you know, your senses, your bodily experience, the way you inhabit a space. And to me, this is also an amazing kind of a translation, again, of research into experience. I don't know if you want to say something about that. It turns into an...
Yeah, but for me, the whole movement into installation was precisely fueled by this desire to alter this habit-ridden encounter with image and text, to change the time that one invests in viewing an image, to alter that relationship. And for me, the alteration came through an evoking of the entire sensorium. So space becomes critical. A photograph hung in space. An encounter with that is very different from a photograph placed on a wall. Simply that. And then what happens with that photograph that's hanging in space? What's happening to your body? The very first time I installed like that, every time you moved, you actually saw a different image behind that image, because I made those layers transparent. So this is directly linked to research, because research continuously reveals the multi-natured nature of anything that you inquire into, and here one was trying to embody and share that experience, so that the viewer or the viewer participant, because I like to think of people who come into my work as active, as participants, and not simply passively consuming images, because there you made your own sets by the way you moved. So if you stood in this position, you would see one set of images behind, and if you moved this way, you would see another, and you might prefer this one to that one, because the whole thing was constructed in the form of an elliptical shape, which you could move around. So that desire to bring the body, to make the body central, to inhabit space in the full sense of habitation, and to evoke the sensorium, have been concerns for a long time. And I'm never sure if I'm not satisfied that I actually achieved this to the level that I would like to in any work. But this I wish to do when I continue to experiment with ways of doing it, and I keep trying again. So.
Now thinking like this, sensorially, thinking of how to translate, how to manipulate perceptions by altering the height or the placement of an object or the scale of the room that it's contained in, is of course very much thinking like an artist, and we see Sheba in her incarnation as an artist, but her career or her trajectory actually begins from a history of activism in which she started out as a photographer who worked on documentation and advocacy with women's groups. And it was various experiments that she started doing where she became dissatisfied with the cliches that this activist photography itself generates and perpetuates, which led her to explore different ways of sharing that work, which then led her into installation, which then led her into this kind of rich panoply that we have seen today. But Sheba, when you look back on this journey, where you see what might have concerned or preoccupied you 25 years ago, and today as you have a set of concerns, you have a body of material that you wish in some way to shape into an installation, and you're constantly then also having to take technical and aesthetic decisions. So that occupies a lot of your time, right? How do you feel about yourself, your artist self?
Slippery ground.
We're only friends here, and we won't tell, right? So.
Well, I think the first experiment that I did with the staged portraits with the women activists was about the self is performed and there being multiple selves. So I would say I would not make any kind of linear trajectory between the activist self, the artist self, or the speaking self, or the listening self, but that all these selves coexist, and it's a polyvalent state. In certain situations, a particular self will be more foregrounded, more charged, or more quiescent, depending on multiple factors. So I also have some problem with this articulation of the notion of self as a given or as a delimited, discrete entity. This may not be the appropriate place to go into it, but I am a follower of philosophic doctrine of dependent origination from Buddhist philosophy, which breaks down the notion of there being any autonomous existence of self. So in the work I do, and this is a kind of guiding principle, what I seek is actually conversations between subjectivities. I think subjectivities are produced in particular situations, and this fuels very much the idea of the contemplative side. And the conversation with another subjectivity, but that the self is not discrete, but is actually constituted in that moment by its relationship to what's around it. So it is, in that sense, originating independence on the factors around it. So this self that is speaking right now is produced by this moment and does not have an inherent existence that persists separately. This idea is crucial to my mind to ecological thinking, because a lot of the ontological source of the great crisis we face is a separation between self and other and between self and nature, where nature is seen as separate from ourselves, and in fact the non-human, that is all the vast, rich creatures that co-inhabit this earth, are seen as separate from us. So we see ourselves as separate from the tiger that we are trying to save. And this lies at the heart of the disjuncture between the way we think of ourselves as human and the way we conceptualize notions of self is crucial to that. And for me, part of the healing of that wound lies in rethinking and interrogating these ideas of self. So I don't know if you expected me to go off into this.
Oh, no, not quite into that. I thought you might complain about the demands of galleries and the pressure of producing for the next Biennale. But you put me in my place. Instead of quotidian things, you have shown me quite clearly the level at which you exist, as opposed to the level at which I exist and think. And so again...
To argue against that, I want to connect what we've been talking about and what I spoke about and what Kavi spoke about. Because what I'm finding is that while I do produce and show in galleries and museums and in public art contexts, I cannot be satisfied, I think that should be self-evident, with showing in galleries. So for me, it's almost like a lifeboat, a raft, Noah's Ark, that I look at the museum. And that the possibility the museum offers to actually create spaces to construct a public imaginary, to be able to explore together these different ways of imagining the world, our cultural memory, ourselves. So when you look at what's happening even to this particular very focused analysis you did of heritage, the Maharajas and the museumization of that, what is happening to these multiple kinds of imaginaries that get placed in the public domain there? And how would you connect the potential of museums? Because these are public domain spaces. I mean, technically galleries are places that anybody can walk into, but only 200 or 300 people have the confidence and the class confidence to go into it. So how would you look at this kind of provocation I'm making on sites of contemplation, public domain, and what you're seeing in museums today?
This is a complicated kind of terrain. I mean, for one thing, in India, the majority of the spaces that we think of as museum spaces of any description are associated with the idea of heritage. And the idea of heritage is always something that has to be positive. You know, the Chola bronze is so great, the Phulkari is so great, you know, everything is very nice, everything is very good. And so to have firstly the idea also of the museum as a forum, as a place in which you don't necessarily always celebrate something, but you also can be troubled by something. I don't think we have that at this moment in this place. So even something that have become quite routine in the museology in a number of places where the museum makes visible the troubled stories that lie even behind the things that it celebrates. Like, I have this Chola bronze to show you. How did I get it? You know, I got it because it was dug out of the ground, and the government has a rule that says everything that's dug out of the ground belongs to me. So even though 20 people were chasing the truck and I took it out of the village, I still felt I had the right. You know, the museum will not deconstruct its own power or will not make visible its own processes. And we do not have that kind of maturity in our public culture right now. We are still very much like a new country that needs to bang on the drum and tom-tom and talk about how great we are, which to me is a form of insecurity. That's also the reason why we cannot change things, you know. We're not open to critique, and therefore we're not open to re-examination. And so what was done in 1950 by some pioneer has to be enshrined, you know, in some way. So these are some of the problems that we have. On the other scale of things, when we look at how terrible our museums are, and when people try to improve them, there'll be a new director or an IAS officer who will come in and say, okay, I'm going to fix something. What they'll do is they'll fix a building, they'll put a coat of paint, they'll buy good lights, and some of the objects will just be better placed. There might be a cafeteria that opens, but the deeper functionings of a museum, you know, the fact that it might be a place in which there can be discussion, learning, pleasure, troubling, enjoyment, knowledge is created, love for things is fostered, that doesn't remain. And peculiarly then, I think that it is in the galleries today, in the private galleries which are very elite, which are tied into the market, which have a very limited reach, but it is those places, despite their market, you know, they're being embedded in the market, that we actually have something like a vanguard, because they actually allow trouble to occur there sometimes, you know, something troubling, something difficult.
That has taken time. So the early works, because the nature of my work is such that it's not easily saleable, and galleries are about saleable work. So the early venues that I found for my work were cultural centers, which actually allowed a certain amount of trouble, not too much, some public art projects. So these are public domain sites already. The gallery in the last period of time, in the last 5 years, which is really recent, has begun to actually open up the space for work which is experimental, challenging, as long as it sits along with some work by the same artist that actually is something that lends itself to commercial activity. So I think we mustn't lose sight of
it's the chonge which ovi aa gaya type of thing. Na?
So these are negotiations. They're also negotiations between artists who wish to do something large and experimental, and yet will then negotiate the fact that they'll only get the space or the support if they do something that hangs on the wall and that can be sold to somebody and cover costs. So this is also a very real self amongst the multiple selves. It's a negotiation, and it's capricious, because with that whole business about the market crash, there was this return to painting and all of that. So markets are by nature capricious, patronage is by nature capricious. So I would still put my faith in enlivening, expanding, re-envisioning the public institutions that we have to make them more vigorous and more substantial spaces for knowledge creation.
Well, we're sitting here on a platform that clearly shows us that things can be done. Life can be infused into institutions that often lapse into dormancy. And so let's hope that in the many people who are assembled here, there are going to be more engines of energy which will allow other places to get activated, like the Lalit Kala in Chandigarh is currently
It's
activated.
absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I find what's happening here and what's been happening here for a while, it's more alive, more active than any other Lalit Kala I know. It's especially Delhi, which goes through brief flurries of activity and then becomes moribund again. It's kind of absolutely sandbagged with bureaucracy and all sorts of unpleasant stuff, which one needn't go into, but we do have these institutions. We have a proviso in the Constitution that says any major public construction project should give 1% to public art. Now this tends to get spent on murals or monuments. we can actually, there is a provision. It would take a lot of energy, drive, persistence to access this for other kinds of public domain work, which doesn't mean erecting yet another thing for birds to sit on. But so these possibilities are there. I also think that alongside state institutions, there is the emergence, which is a welcome emergence, of private public institutions. So the private museum, the collector who was earlier content with having a luxurious house full of art and also patronized experimental art, is now actually entering public domain. We have 2 museums already in Delhi, the Devi Art Foundation and the Kiran Nadar Museum, both in Noida and Saket. And there I hear of several others emerging all over the country. These are sometimes linked to corporate funds, sometimes simply to very wealthy people who have a passion for the arts. But this is again a space which is public domain. For whatever reasons that these people are wishing to share.
And for whatever duration.
And for whatever duration,
share.
let us actually really grasp these possibilities.
So perhaps with that now we should open it out to the audience if there are questions.
Seen wonderful artists who are so good at painting or sculpting. They're so skilled, so talented, so creative, but they are not kind of as gifted with this form of thinking, contemplating, articulating, and gifted with the gap of the words, and be as good as while creating something in the visual arts. You have seen people creating stories about something which is very, very ordinary in terms of visual expression. But you've seen people who create wonderful ideas in images, but they're unable to express that in words. But here is a combination of both. In Sheba, you see when she speaks, you can imagine, and she can actually really take you there where she really intends to. And when you look at the work, it takes you through an experience which cannot be experienced through the words. So if she was not speaking, probably we may miss something in the visual. If we did not see the visual, we would miss something. It's a combination which is a must, and it's a rare combination. I haven't come across anybody who is so gifted in both the forms of expression. And she's giving a new form of visual expression and the oral expression. And it's just wonderful. Thank you so much. And there, Kavita. What a wonderful art historian she is. She's curated exhibition, but she picks up, the threads so minutely. And I have heard conversation between Anish Kapoor and, Homi Bhabha, and where sometimes, the critic tries to dominate the, creator and, try to probably maybe tell people that I'm also equally gifted, I can, And the conversation actually doesn't lead to anything which is meaningful, or the audience or the viewer doesn't really come out more, blessed with a new idea, new thought. Yeah, most of them were taking us through such wonderful ideas, the journeys, and creating new paths of thinking. I have no other words. Now, a question.
Ma'am, going back to your works, there's this work that's been done by you, Ganga's Daughters. Could you share a little bit about the work with us?
Ganga's Daughters is a photo-video installation. The photographs are taken over a very long span of time, over 10 years, of spending time with, hanging out with women sadhus, mainly in northern and eastern India. I grew very interested in women mendicants for several reasons. One was that these are women who step out of the frame of family. They're not wives, they're not mothers, they're not daughters. They are women who define themselves in relation to the metaphysical, whatever form the metaphysical may take, whether it is Krishna, the God as a lover, as in Mirabai, or the Shaivite who takes on an almost androgynous character to better reach her Lord, etc. I also encountered, I think I'm losing the thread, so these, for me, I encountered extraordinary texts, poetry from the 4th century onwards, from Karaikalammayar, who writes as a fey, a ghost, or dancing, turning somersaults, cartwheeling, transforming from this beautiful, sensuous Punitavati into this skeletal figure. To Mirabai, who's well known, to Akka Mahadevi, to Lalit of Kashmir, to a number of women poets and wanderers whose poetry is startlingly contemporary in the way it looks at the female body, at this kind of separation between sexuality and spirituality, which is being set up through patriarchal and conventional religious streams, which most of these other traditions, which are heterodox traditions, actually challenge. An investigation of bodily transformation, etc., etc. So in spending time with such groups of women over the years, I grew very interested in what is often an area of exploration for artists working with performativity and gender. So from, I don't know if you people are familiar with Judith Butler and her theorizing on gender as being performative, but here was a rich vernacular stream that had existed for thousands of years, where in fact women were reinventing themselves in relation to a chosen performative identity. When I say chosen, I would put inverted commas around it, because a lot of the women, they may come from a genuine, powerful spiritual call. They may be escaping a situation of violence. They may simply need to leave their situation and know through tradition that this space exists for women who leave the family. So there are many kinds of women that enter this process, but what's crucial to becoming a Ganga's daughter is dying to your older identity. So you perform your own death rites, not just for yourself, but to up to 7 pidis, 7 generations before. So you're stripped of name, hair, clothes, family, gotra, everything, and all the markers of femininity. And you're reborn, usually given a name which is one of the rivers, which is why I call the series Ganga's Daughters. So this work looks at a kind of vernacular proto-feminist. It's proto-feminist from my eyes, not from the way the women see it themselves. They see themselves as reinventing themselves within a religious framework. I don't know if I've answered your question. It's actually a large body of work and quite complex. So essentially the work looks at the performativity of gender and the opportunities that that space offers women today, and their lacks, and many, many hundreds of thousands of women who inhabit that space in this country today.
What a wonderful combination. I think, Sheba, you did the right thing, you insisted. In fact, I was trying to pair Kavita with someone else, and then I'm feeling...
I'm really delighted that Kavi and me have been able to do this together. Really.
Not trying to dominate the other, but trying to actually get the best out of each other, and without actually patting each other's back. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your very, very kind words for the Academy.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience. Thank you, Devan, for making this happen. And more power to you.
Thank you. More power to us.
All of you at the Lalit Kala.
Thank you. We are a small family now. You see how, with such wonderful expressions, all of them are sitting. we are a family. They're feeling so, kind of, जैसे ऊपर से कुछ मिल गया. सारे के सारे मुझे तो अपने ही लगते हैं, ऐसे लगता है कि यही हैं सब. आपको भी ऐसी लगता होगा. Thank you so much. Now I invite Professor Goswami to kindly share his thoughts with us. Professor Goswami.
When I'm at an evening like this, I'm constantly asking myself the question as to what am I going to take home from this evening? And I can tell you that I'm taking home a great deal from this evening. 2 or 3 things. I'm sure everyone has realized that the evening was an evening of invitation. We were all being invited to see things differently, to perceive things differently. We began with Kavita, whose work I have known for some years, and we ended with Sheba. Let me just take a couple of minutes on the impressions, the images that were reverberating through my mind or were striking against ideas of my own. When Sheba showed that image at the very first one, where there were small sort of snippets of parts of the body, the mouth, the nose, the eyes, and so on and so forth. I suddenly felt, after she had finished, that I was able to smell things differently, I was able to see things differently, able to speak about things differently perhaps. Now that is the power of expression, the power of an artist like Sheba, to be able to lead us through very interesting, provocative, saddening channels into thinking about things very, very differently. When she showed those images of the Rahal in Kashmir and those photographs of posters pasted on the walls, I don't know how many of you can read Urdu. Not very many, I imagine. But there's one line which I'm sure she must have paid a great deal of attention to. लाशा जो लग रहा है वो शाहिद अमाम है. He who is clinging to that dead body is a Shahid Amam. May not be the name of the individual, but Shahid Amam. Amam is the prophet, right? And the one who is a witness to what is happening all around ourselves. Shahid Amam. There's something deeply moving about these, not only the images that she has assembled together, but the way she leads us into that particular world of extraordinary barren sadness. And the installation with which she ended, the water diviner, which is superb images. She's asking us to be a diviner. Each one of us, she said so in so many words. But how do we get into things, divine what is underneath, and so on? So all of us have to bring, in a certain measure of, or in a certain manner of speaking, our energies, summon them and enter a work of art or enter a situation which provokes a work of art or brings it to being. I got the sensation of, the chilti jati ho ehsaas ke parde jaise, like that. Or when we saw the images of the Kashmiri women and so on, people grieving, then khoon ke dhabbe dhulenge kitni barsaaton ke baad, as Faiz said. Ye khoon ke dhabbe dhulenge kitni barsaaton ke baad, like that. Now likewise, when Kavita was speaking, she was again provoking us, provoking a person like me, provoking many of us who are involved in the museum world to think about museums differently. What do museums stand for? I mean, when she had that wonderful sort of opening statement, what is heritage meant to be? And how museums are reinventing themselves, need to reinvent themselves, but also asking the question again and again, are we being invited by these palace museums to leave our skins behind and enter a different skin? Very much like the manner in which, for instance, there is tourism now of slums of India, right? Tourists by the hordes are being taken to Dharavi, for instance, in Bombay. I mean, we want to experience something that we have never experienced, or even for that brief moment, I mean, to leave our skins behind and enter different areas and different skins. Now, this whole business, I mean, I can tell you a great deal about museums. It's not the place for me to do that. But I'll just share with you how little we think about what museums are like and how much work she is doing in this particular area. You know, years ago, and I've been very concerned with museums and the kind of pits into which they have fallen over the years. Long ago, Pupul Jayakar asked me as to what can be done about museums. Mrs. Indira Gandhi was at that time the Prime Minister of India, and Pupul was very close to her. And I said, let's get together the directors of the museums and discuss things. What is wrong with our museums? How can we mend it? It's a very simplistic kind of a thing to do. And it so happened that the meeting was called, but I was out of the country. I had to leave for some reason. And when I came back, I asked one of the directors of the museums in India, the leading museum of India, so to speak, in Bombay. मैंने कहा क्या हुआ उस मीटिंग में? अरे सब मैंने सब बता दिया, क्या हमारे में गलती क्या है, सब ठीक कर दिया मैंने. That gentleman thought that he had provided the answers to all the ills of the museums in the course of one evening and put the mind of Pupul Jayakar and Indira Gandhi straight in one fell swoop, as it were, and so on and so forth. That is what we know of our museum. That's what the way we think about them. That is what, I mean, there's no self-examination of any kind at all, and so on. So there are museums and museums and museums, and there are people and people and people, right? So when she talks about museums, and she has only concentrated here in this particular presentation on a small segment of palace museums, I was hoping that she'll talk about the Qila Mubarak with which she has been engaged in, would have been sort of much closer to our lives, so to speak. But questions are being raised, and she's inviting us, like Sheba was inviting us in her own fashion, to ask questions, to contemplate, to enter things a little more deeply than we do in our wretched lives, and so on and so forth. So, as I said, I have been fortunate in being present at these 3 evenings, and each time I'm taking something different with me home, things to think about, things to be grateful for. You know, the range of things that we are looking at in these three days, and hopefully for the next 3 also, you know, reminds me of, I'm sorry, I just know a little bit here, there, and so on and so forth, but the verse of Ghalib comes again to my mind. What does he say? सद जलवा रूबरू है जो मिजगा उठाइए, सद जलवा रूबरू है जो मिजगा उठाइए, इतना है बस दीदार के सामान लाइए. All you have to do is to lift your eyelashes a little. A myriad sights are there for you to see, whether in life or in art. But you have to have the wherewithal with which to see. I didn't wish to pontificate, I didn't wish to issue certificates either to Sheba or to Kavita. Just wanted to share with you my excitement at having been here this particular evening. And may I thank you, Kavita, may I thank you, Sheba, for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Goswami. Thank you all.